Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll just do some quick introductions. So my name is Jennifer Mcgowan. I'm the Emergency Program Coordinator for the municipality. Also with us tonight is our Fire Chief, Erin Hannon, and Deputy Fire Chief, Ian Thompson. You can see them in the video. And then, of course, the star of the show this evening is Bruce Blackwell. Hi, Bruce. Thanks for joining us. So Bruce has more than 30 years of experience as a professional forester and biologist focused in fire and fire ecology. And he wrote the Community Wildfire Protection Plan for Bowen Island, and hopefully we'll write the next one when that gets updated. Bruce is considered a provincial expert in fire and fuel management and has managed numerous innovative projects related to fire risk identification and mitigation for both the public and private sector. And I'm sure he'll tell us more about his background and to us here tonight. So thank you, Bruce, for joining us, and thanks everyone who was able to jump on this evening.
Perfect.
I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Do you want me to put up the PowerPoint, or do you want to put? Okay,
that'd be great if you can.
I'll share my screen here. You have to allow me to share my screen.
So I'll turn that over to Erin on the. Sorry.
No worries.
Do you know how to do that, Erin? Can you switch the host over to me just for a sec? Sorry.
Or make you co-host.
Yeah, or you can switch it actually to Bruce would probably be the best idea. When you find Bruce on the right-hand side under the participants list, just change, yeah. Sorry, Bruce.
No worries. Okay, I should be able to share now. And I'm going to share that screen there. And so can everybody see my slides?
You bet.
Okay, good. All right, welcome everybody, and thanks for spending this beautiful evening inside listening to me talk about fire, which hopefully we won't see of any this summer, but who knows. As Jen said, I've been doing this for a long time. I've delivered Firesmart workshops all over the province, and I've delivered actually quite a few on Bowen and very well participated. So very happy you're here tonight. I'm going to talk to you about the key steps to protecting your home during a fire event. And really it's focused on two key elements. One is your structure, the building that you live in, your house, and any outbuildings that you may have. And the second thing is the proximity and type of vegetation that you have next to your dwelling on home. That's really the key focus of Firesmart and the key elements of what we'll talk about tonight. We'll talk about some other things as well. But let's get started with framework of risk. We know that we've had significant fire seasons over the last 20 years in British Columbia. And this list doesn't include 2018, but we've seen significant losses here in British Columbia, in Alberta with Slave Lake, Fort McMurray, California, Washington, Oregon, and this past winter we saw what happened in Australia. And in my opinion, it seems from work that I've been doing with hydro that we're seeing an increase of about 10% in the climatic conditions that promote catastrophic fire. So if I bracketed the last 20 years and compared that to the last, say 70 years, there's about a 10% increase in the number of days that I would say contribute to catastrophic fire, which is pretty significant. That doesn't mean we can't get fires on other days, but fires that would threaten homes, do significant damage has increased substantially. And I don't know how many of you have followed the P&G bankruptcy case in California, but the utility, through poor maintenance practices with trees intersecting their transmission line, caused a number of significant fires in Northern California in 2018. And the losses were in the billions of dollars. I think it's it's a very high number. We don't have to get into the details of it. And that company has gone into bankruptcy, and they're just in the process of trying to emerge from bankruptcy. And there's still people that are not happy with some of the terms and conditions for protecting against fire. So these are big issues, and they're affecting a lot of people in the world and a lot of communities. And I can say also that the insurance business is being heavily impacted by this. I'm working on several projects with utilities in Western Canada, and I'm involved with their insurers, looking at risk and probability of increasing fire. So it's being taken very seriously by government, by big industry, but one of the places that we need it to be more seriously considered is at the individual property level, because as governments, as stakeholders, really we can't influence what an individual does on their own property. The most impactful thing we can do is educate them and try and facilitate assisting people in upgrading their property so it is in fact fire smart. So there's two key types of interface risk that we look at, and this slide shows intermixed, which is islands of homes or individual homes that are embedded in the forest, and we have the interface, which we define as the line where the forest meets the community. And we can have also spot fire risk, which is where embers from a fire are aloft into the smoke column, carried a distance, and then fall down on the community and start multiple buildings on fire. And ultimately, it's that spot risk that starts, as I said, numerous homes on fire, and that's what overwhelms the fire department. You have an excellent fire department on Bowen Island, a dedicated group of volunteers and paid staff that are excellent, but really the department is designed to put out a single or maybe a secondary house fire. They're not there to deal with multiple house fires starting all at the same time, and your infrastructure isn't really designed to deal with that. So what working on Firesmart does is help to limit the vulnerability of your property to one, this interface fire coming out of the forest and this spotting risk. And that's largely what we're going to talk about this evening, is these key elements. And I'll show you a video. And while you're at home, sitting in bed or sitting on the couch wondering what to do in these COVID times, there is an excellent documentary on Netflix on the Paradise Fire in California. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, watching it, because it really kind of documents how quickly and how difficult conditions can get, and the complexities of trying to evacuate large numbers of people in one of these fire events. So we're concerned about fire coming out of the community and coming into the community. And I say, when I say coming out of the community, a house fire during very high fire danger periods has a lot of potential to move out of the footprint of the house into the forest, particularly if there's trees or vulnerable vegetation that acts as a conduit to move the fire into the forest. And I would suggest that on Bowen Island, that's probably one of the greatest risks of a forest fire starting, is a house fire starting, moving into trees, and then that fire carrying out into the greater landscape and threatening a lot more houses. There's also the threat of someone or lightning starting a forest fire somewhere on the island, and that fire growing to its size that it comes to the edge where homes are and threatens homes through radiant heat and the transfer of flame onto buildings and structures. So we have two ways of fire happening in the community, one coming out of the community, one coming into the community. When I started doing community wildfire protection plans back in 2005 and 2006, just after the 2003 fires, I did a lot of work on the coast. In fact, Bowen's community wildfire protection plan was done in 2007 as part of a Metro Vancouver project. And at that time, I was saying that the probability of a significant fire was, in most cases, low to moderate, but the consequences were very high. We've seen in the last few years, the fire at Horseshoe Bay and at White Lake, I think it's the Strip Creek fire and the White Lake fire, that the possibility of a significant fire has dramatically increased in some of these high hazard conditions that we've seen in the last 20 years. And I don't think, I think it's only a matter of time before we have a significant interface fire in southern British Columbia, whether that's in Metro Vancouver, whether that's in the Greater Victoria area, somewhere on Vancouver Island, or even up in the Fraser Valley. There is a lot of interface at risk now. There's a significant amount of forest and a significant amount of biomass in coastal forests. And we are now seeing conditions where those fires or those forests can burn with tremendous intensity and are very difficult to control. And I'll highlight a fire that occurred in Squamish just last month. I just finished the community wildfire protection plan for Squamish, and we had just proposed a fuel break in the valley where that fire occurred, not in the exact area. But the conditions, I think it was April 19th, we had what we describe as crossover conditions, and that's where fire behavior becomes a very serious issue, and the relative humidity falls below the temperature, the ambient air temperature. And when that happens, we generally have very high fire risk conditions. We usually have warnings out to firefighters. And for goodness sakes, this was April, unheard of in my career on the coast. The fire burned in a fuel type that I would never have really expected to burn significantly in, largely on rock, moss over rock with scattered maples and Douglas fir cedar. It burned up all the moss on the rock. It scorched most of the cedar so that it died. It took out a major distribution power line and that had to be replaced, and burned out several buildings. All started from somebody doing some backyard burning where they actually had done a good job of guarding the fire, being ready for the fire, but the wind and the temperature and relativity that I described were so significant for this time of year that that fire was able to escape and burned 100 hectares over 2 days, which, as I said, I found it absolutely shocking. It would be something I never would have predicted. And our actual risk analysis of this area showed this area to have a relatively low risk. So when we talk about risk, we're really looking at what the probability of the fire is. And as I've been saying tonight, I believe the probability here on the coast is going up, and it's moving into what I would describe as moderate to high. And the consequence is going up because we're building more and more homes and developing more properties in these interface conditions. And unless we actively intervene, we're going to see some consequences. Some of these homes are going to burn, and probably in a significant fire. So these homes kind of depict different kinds of interface. And I've been to some of the strata units on Bowen and visited various homes, and there's lots of homes on Bowen that look just like these, homes that are surrounded by forest, where people have moved there to live closer to nature, more solitude, more aesthetic pleasure, but are unassuming of the risks that this vegetation poses to their structure and to their property. So as I described earlier, we're concerned with a fire starting materials that we'll call as embers. And this picture shows a bunch of leaves and little twigs and branches. These were burning embers that were collected after the Okanagan Mountain Park fire in 2003 that were rained down into the community. These burning embers land on vulnerable wood or portions of the property where there's a potential for ignition, and they start the house on fire. This is the other thing that I described, the radiant heat from the edge of the fire, heating up the structure and starting one structure on fire. And the other interesting thing is if you don't have proper interhousing spacing, and the NFPA suggests that you need 9 meters between homes, that's 27 feet, you're gonna have house-to-house contact from one house to the next house to the next house. And this is what we saw in Fort McMurray, this is what we saw in Slave Lake, and we've seen it in numerous fires in British Columbia over the last few years, where one home starts on fire and then multiple homes are burned in that particular fire. And this schematic here is showing you that just a different portrayal. The orange dots represent burning embers. The white dots represent embers that are no longer burning. And you can see it's a function of how high the smoke column is and what the conditions are, both wind and relative humidity, and how long those embers stay alight and where they come in contact with the ground or with buildings or with vegetation, whether they ignite something or not. The greater the wind speed, the longer the distance this burning ember shower will carry. So when we start getting up to 25, 30 kilometers an hour, we see that these embers can be carried kilometers. In BC, we use 2 kilometers as our sort of planning window, but we know that we can see distances of spotting up to 5 kilometers in some of these big wind events. And you have to remember, the wind in these conditions is not driven by the ambient wind of the atmosphere. It's driven by the wind created by the fire. So as the fire gets bigger, it starts inhaling more oxygen, which brings up the wind, and it sort of starts to really build. And the larger the fire gets, the more significant the independent wind that it creates gets, and the more severe the ember shower becomes. So it's quite often that we see in these big fires that the winds that the fire generates exceed 30 and 40 kilometers in some situations, depending on the atmospheric conditions. So I have a video, and I'm just going to show you a video which really plays the principles out of this ember shower. This is done by the Disaster Safety Organization, Insurance Institute in the States, and they do a lot of testing for hurricanes, for hail and other natural disasters and flooding that impact homes. So they've constructed a home of different materials, and they're gonna load up a bunch of material that can burn and generate embers, and then they're gonna spray this house with a fan array of the embers. So this is just demonstrating that typical plants and landscaping materials such as mulch that you have around your house. These are azaleas, common shrubs that we have that are planted right next to the home. And one of the big messages in Firesmart is you don't want this material within 1.5 meters of your home. Because once the ember shower comes, this portion of garden around your house will ignite. So these are the embers coming out of the array of fans, and there's hundreds of thousands of them. And
sorry, Bruce, let me just jump on. I don't think we can see the screen you can see.
Oh, okay.
Your screen sharing, you might have to tell it that you're on a different.
Okay, just a second.
Sorry.
Sorry, Jennifer. I better start.
No, that's okay.
This is doing these in Zoom. Okay, can you? Okay, so let's just see. Now, does that work? No. Okay, hang on, let's go back.
We
okay, I'm
were
gonna
able
close
to
things.
see your browser when you clicked on that link, so that might be the ticket.
You did see that? Sorry.
Correct, yeah.
Hang on, so just a sec. It's in this browser here.
Great, yeah, that worked.
Okay, just a sec, that's that. Okay, now let me just try it again. Do you see that?
No, sir.
Oh, okay.
Just, I would suggest stop sharing and then jump back on again with.
Stop share. Okay, good point. And then we'll go here. I apologize. How about that?
Not yet.
Okay, nothing?
Nothing, no screen share at this stage.
Okay, just a second. That's weird. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just close everything here. Okay, so let's go put that over there. This is over here. Apologize for this. Close. Okay. I'm just closing Explorer completely and then trying it again. Okay. So let's try that. Okay, that's no good. And then that. How about now? No?
Can you just go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and press share screen?
Yeah, I will. It's just, okay. Let's just, oh, here we go. Let's try that. That should work. Okay, there we go. Now that's, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, here we go. So that we'll walk through this again. They're putting bark mulch, and this is about to, they're gonna landscape around the house, as I said, and then they're gonna spray this house with embers. It has a bunch of different building materials, a bunch of different things that are combustible and not combustible. And you're gonna see how this house burns. So they use 5 ember generators, and the wind speeds here are about 20 kilometers with the fans. And you can see that they spray all this material as embers. And I would say that that ember shower you see to the left that's moving into the house is very realistic of what I've experienced in some of these kind of fires and what you'll see in any film. So that actually is a very realistic video. And you're going to see that it's going to start the landscaping on fire, and it's going to start various elements of the house with different construction materials on fire. So the wood roofing that you saw that shakes, the vinyl siding and vinyl aluminum gutters you're going to see are going to stay intact. But you're going to see that the other parts, the siding on the left is hardy board and it doesn't catch on fire. So, and the Duroid doesn't catch on fire, only the material that's on the roof that's combustible, which is the leaf and moss that's there. So it's a Class A rated roof, Duroid roof, not expensive, but you'll see the straw, and when you don't clean your roof and all that vegetation material stays there, then the roof catches on fire. So the other thing that we're worried about is materials moving into the attic and catching the attic on fire, and materials moving through the fire, moving through the windows. It's a single pane window, and you're going to see some of that happen here. And you're also going to see how the wood siding catches on fire, but the hardy board next to it does not catch on fire. So you really get to see the vulnerability of different materials that the house is constructed of and how they burn during one of these events. So the fiber cement, which we call hardy board, it's a composite of wood and cement. It really is only slightly damaged. The vinyl siding on the right melts. And you can see that garden vegetation is all engaged in the fire. And you can see here the spots, because there's not proper screening into the attic, and this also applies to the soffits, the embers blow into the structure and start the internal attic of the structure on fire. Here we look at the window and the penetration of embers and flame through the window, which, if there were curtains, furniture, all the rest of it, would start the inside of the house on fire. Again, only a single pane window, blows right through the glass. So this gives you a really good idea of the kind of impact an ember shower would have. And now I'm going to see if I can, okay, let's see if I can share another screen here. Let's get this back on. And I'll go back to where we were. So I think what I want to say is that the lesson, I mean, when your home isn't ready for a fire like this, everybody kind of panics and goes, well, I've got wood siding, I've got this, I've got that, I can't do anything about it. The most single important thing you can do to your home to protect it from these types of fires is, if you've got wood roofing or roofing that will burn, that you change to a rated roof. And so when you are re-roofing, you make that roofing change, or if you're really worried about this, you do it retroactively. I am a strata member in a condominium in Whistler, and we have a shake roof. I have never been happy with that shake roof since I moved into the development, and I've been on the strata council now for a few years, and I've convinced the strata council to move away from wood roofing. We're about 5 years out of needing to replace the roof. Problem is, if you go to metal roofing, which is probably the best thing to do in Whistler, we've got to upgrade the engineering of the struts and everything. So it's about $1 million project just to refit the building. So we've been saving, and it'll be 5 years before we get the roofing changed, but we're moving in that direction. And that's the kind of thing that I'm advocating, that, you know, maybe your house doesn't need a re-roofing job right now, but at least the next time that you go and replace your roof, that you do it with the right material in a thoughtful way, so that you're not vulnerable to this ember shower. I can say that the research suggests that about 80% of homes that have rated roofing will survive an ember shower. So this is a significant issue. The other thing is that, you know, you've got to rely on suppression resources, the fire department, the BC Wildfire Service, to come and deal with a fire on your property. So one, you want to make sure that your property is easily accessible. If you've got 200 meters of forest that fire trucks have to drive through, or you've got a lot of vegetation where it's going to be difficult to get retardant on the ground, or if you don't have enough space around your house to set up a sprinkler system or some kind of suppression system, most resources are probably going to abandon your home if they don't think they have a good opportunity to suppress a fire or protect your home. So not only are these principles important from just not an ignition point of view, but they're also important in that what we're talking about here will allow firefighters to move onto your property and actually protect your structure. That's the other important consideration. So really tonight, what we're talking about is mitigating the risk at the individual property level. And my hope is that, you know, I think I saw 17 or 18 people participating tonight. Well, if every one of you gets out and gets the word out to your neighbors, and they get the word out to their neighbors, we're going to have a much better educated community that's working collectively towards dealing with this issue across the community. And I think we've probably hit over the last 2 summers. I'm guessing, Jen, about 120 people, but you would know better than I. But I mean, we've had very good participation, and the more participation we get, the better. So, Jen, can you speak to how many people have participated over the last couple of years?
Sure, yeah, I can race to look for the actual numbers while you complete your presentation, but there have been well over 100.
Yeah, which I think is great, and it's very important. So, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, there's 2 main avenues to protect your home. One is to change the vegetation type, the density and setback from the building, and the other is to change the structure materials to reduce the vulnerability of fire and the potential for fire to spread to or from a building. When we talk about vegetation, ideally we don't want trees, flammable vegetation that's within 10 meters, 30 feet of the building. Why 10 meters? Why 30 feet? That's the distance that radiant heat will dissipate to a level that it won't start the building on fire. When we talk about changing the structure, that's changing the roofing. Maybe you want to change the siding. Maybe you want to sheathing your deck. There's a number of things that you can do to lower the vulnerability of your building to fire if you have both either an ember shower or you have flame contact on the house. So we tend to look at Firesmart in a 4 zone now. So this actually has been modified. That area 1.5 meters away from your house, you don't want bark mulch, you don't want flammable vegetation, because that lower vegetation, as you saw, that was immediately adjacent to the house, actually started the house on fire. And work by a fellow named Al Westhaver after the Fort McMurray fires, he altered the Firesmart guidelines so that we actually have a zone 1 and a zone 1A. And the zone 1A is that 1.5 meters immediately adjacent to the house, where we don't want a lot of vegetation. We don't want bark mulch, because as you saw in the video, the bark mulch burns, and it burns pretty actively. And unfortunately, people really like bark mulch, but bark mulch close to your house is not a good solution. If you're really, keen to protect your property further, you can move out to 10 to 30 meters and 30 to 100 meters away from the building footprint, where you would consider removing surface fuels, thinning out small trees, and removing that vegetation so that fire is not is likely to stay on the ground, is going to stay on the ground such that the intensity is it's achievable to put the fire out relatively easy with ground crews. I would suggest that this discussion tonight is really focused on that 10 meters around your house. While some of you have bigger properties, it's a big job to Firesmart your whole property. The key area to focus is that 10-meter area. Once you've got that sorted out, then you can move further out into the landscape. So what we're trying to do is take steps to stop fire moving from the forest to a building or home, or spreading from a building or a home to the forest. There are several websites. There's a British Columbia Firesmart website. There's a national Firesmart website. And if you want to get all the detailed materials, you can download those. Or I believe Ian and Jen have materials available at the fire hall or at City Hall that you can get that support a lot of the principles and provide more guidance around some of the Firesmart stuff we're talking about tonight. So here we go, looking at a home from an overview perspective and the 3 zones. And you can see really we're focused on this zone right here. And I can tell you, if this zone is managed properly, the structure is hardened off from fire, you have a very high probability of surviving one of these events. There's a number of examples during the summer of 2018 where these kinds of footprint were properly managed and the homes actually survived an absolutely horrendous fire. This is an example of Fort McMurray. Many people didn't believe this aspen stand would burn, but what happened was there were a lot of small spruce trees which are very flammable that were growing in the understory of this forest. And they're what actually carried the fire, brought it into town. And you can see it's a kind of hodgepodge of homes that built. Most of these homes here on the left-hand side of the photo burned as house-to-house contact. And basically there was enough vegetation between the houses and among the houses that fire was able to spread to each of the homes. And they had elements of each of those homes that weren't fire smart, and they had garden and mulch material that was close to the building. The interesting thing is, if you look at these buildings that did not burn, you don't see a lot of mulch garden immediately adjacent to the homes. They're mostly green grass. They have rated roofing. Those are Duroid roofs, and they were largely constructed of hardy board or material that wasn't vulnerable to radiant heat. And the most interesting house to me is this gray house right in the center, closest to the edge of the forest, and yet it didn't burn. Why? Because it had 10 meters on the back side. It was relatively clean, no vegetation on the property, and that vegetation didn't, what vegetation was there wasn't flammable and didn't catch on fire. So it's very interesting to look at some of these events afterwards. So what are the barriers to moving forward with Firesmart? Some of you are probably sitting there, well, okay, I didn't know I had this risk. So that's about education and communication. That's what we're doing tonight. Some people just don't care. Oh, I'm never going to have an interface fire. I don't have to worry about it. Why should I bother? I've got insurance. I can tell you that insurance is changing rapidly. Maybe some of you already know. It's harder and harder to get insurance, and it's more expensive, particularly for strata lots in BC. And that's because losses from floods and fire have been incremented in the last decade or so. And insurers are getting less and less tolerant of losing money. So their first move has been to raise rates across the board in all sectors of society. Why don't they raise rates of homeowners on Bowen specifically? Well, the reality is the Canadian insurance market works on everybody contributing to the greater pool of insurance. And if they just focused on collecting insurance from a small number of rural people, they miss out on collecting in the big cities, and they wouldn't get the leverage in premiums that they need to insure the wider area. So what you're seeing is not only are homeowners in rural communities paying for these losses, but they're paying for it in the city environment as well, even though the risk may not be as high in the city environment. So the other reason a lot of people don't want to do Firesmart is removing this vegetation, particularly to trees, is expensive. If you've got 5 trees you got to remove, each one of those might cost anywhere from $500 to $1,000. So you're looking at fairly significant costs to actually remove the trees from around your home. Other is disposing of the material. How do you get rid of it? Many municipalities don't like large volumes of green waste. I mean, generally some green waste is tolerable. The perceived actions required to be Firesmart are too onerous. Construction of existing homes are difficult to change if it's vulnerable. And the economics of doing this is difficult as well. So there's a number of reasons why people don't want to do this work. So that priority zone 1, we're really interested in that 10-meter zone. Ensure that direct flame contact with the building cannot occur with the vegetation. Reduce the potential for radiant heat to ignite the building. Avoid vegetation such as juniper or cedar. Juniper is like a bomb going off. If any of you, it's got a lot of volatile chemicals in it that, and so does cedar, that will easily ignite, unsafe for firefighters, get very hot and burn very quickly, particularly after 2 or 3 weeks of drought. A lot of people say, well, I irrigate my cedar. Well, even when you irrigate the cedar, if you stick your hand into the stem, you'll find that generally speaking, there's a lot of dead material in the interior of the shrub or juniper, and that material stays dry even though you're irrigating, and it will burn significantly when temperatures are warm and relative humidities are low. I can't emphasize how much that stuff burns. So you want to change the structure. We've talked about roofing material. Exterior, you're looking at the siding. The other thing that's not a great thing is you can see in this slide, there's an open balcony in the background there. Embers get in underneath those balconies and will start them on fire. So often the recommendation is anytime you've got some area like that, you should sheath it in with plywood or material that isn't combustible. And then the building itself, a lot of people put their wood piles right up against the building. That's the simplest thing to take care of. Remove that wood pile. If you have propane that you use to either heat or cook with, and it's a significant size cylinder of propane, it too should be 10 meters away from the building. Propane canisters do explode. They're a hazard to firefighters, and they may be enough of a deterrent that from a safety point of view, firefighters aren't going to try to triage your home or protect your home from an interface fire. So typically what we recommend is that you use copper tubing and that you run that copper tubing 10 meters away from the home, and that you have a cement pad or a clean graveled area where that propane tank can sit safely and not be exposed to any exterior heat from the forest. Again, probably a fairly open, non-vegetative state around that propane tank. Obviously, concrete, stucco, duroid, all of these are different materials that are going to limit fire from igniting the structure or the structure burning. The other important thing that we emphasized was screening your vents, whether those are vents into your attic, whether those are dryer vents, or whether those are the aeration into the soffit. So you can see here, this soffit has one of those linear screens. This screening is excellent. It's the 3 millimeter or less, and it's not going to allow embers to get into the soffits. There are the opportunity that some people are stuck. They've already got cedar siding. They have cedar shakes. They don't want to spend the money to change that. There is some fire retardant that you can, in fact, apply to cedar or wood siding that makes it less flammable. What the principle of this material is it impregnates the pores of the wood with a resin, fills them up, and limits the combustibility and burnability of the material. Now, as this wood weathers, the efficacy of this retardant wears off. So it's not a forever lasting thing. But some people are using it, and I can tell you it's relatively expensive. It's about $100 a gallon. And often you need several gallons to paint a fairly significant space. We go back to that flammability of coniferous vegetation. These were hedging in California, and this just gives you the true picture of how this coniferous flammable hedging will burn. And there's a number of types of hedges that will burn. There's some landscaping that we recommend that's succulent, like for instance, a laurel hedge or a boxwood hedge. Those types of plants don't typically burn like cedar or juniper. So here's some examples on the right. A really nice succulent rock garden with flowers. Excellent kind of landscaping that embers land on here, they're not going to burn. This middle picture with trees in it, this fellow spent a lot of time and effort. It's on Cortez Island, thinking that his property was Firesmart. He graveled a lot of area around the home. He pruned up all his trees, but he still had trees in that 10-meter footprint. He had decking at the front where this was surrounded by mulch, and embers would have caught the mulch on fire and it would have burned underneath the deck and started the whole house on fire. The house itself is largely made out of wood siding, but and unfortunately he was kind of partway there in that example. Here's another backyard, largely have the 10 meters, but Again, a lot of wood in this particular structure, but the patio, the chairs and stuff create a buffer to the home. Here's people cleaning up debris, and then another individual pruning the tops of or the branches of the tree. So there's a whole pile of things to be thinking about around your property, and there's lots you can do to protect that 10-meter footprint. Again, here's the hedging, Western Redcedar hedge. I can tell you that if this is within 10 meters of your home, this first picture on the left, or any of these pictures, that's going to burn your house down if that catches on fire. There is so much heat stored in that vegetation and so much flammability that it would be very difficult to control once it gets going. I've seen this material burn in October on Halloween, started by fireworks. So it is very volatile and is very dangerous, particularly. And the other thing too is a lot of people like to have a hedge that runs down the side of their property or along the side of their house. Well, that's just a conduit for fire to move away from the house, off the property, or from fire to move onto the property. So where you've got these linear hedges, fire is just going to travel down them and find another place to go once the hedge is burned. Another option that you have, if you have material, say siding, that you know is vulnerable, it's been found to be very effective in the hours leading up to a fire to sprinkle the area and increase the relative humidity. So you can imagine those ember showers. If you can find a way to increase the relative humidity around the footprint of your home and on the surfaces of your home, they will this increased relative humidity in this wet area will actually extinguish the embers if they fall on the house. So it's a relatively cheap exercise to buy a rooftop pump. You can see this is a triangular pump that sits on the bracket sits on the top of the roof. The hose goes up to a standard sprinkler head, and this sprinkler actually covers the whole home. It's supported with a gas Honda pump. Why do I say gas? Because very often in these interface events, we have power outages, and these power outages effectively cut off water supply. So if you're on a well that you pump with electricity, you probably want to have a cistern or some stored water on site or in your neighborhood. This is an example from, again, from Cortez, where they had a large old oil tank that was filled with water all summer, and they could use this water to put out a fire ahead of the fire department getting to their property, because the fire department is going to take 15-20 minutes to cross the island to get there. So in certain neighborhoods, these are a good option or a good thought process, or using a sprinkler system. Even if you have to bring water up as seawater, it's better than no water. So you can see there's two types of sprinklers. This one's mounted right into the home. This one depends on a hose. You can buy vinyl cisterns that will collect rainwater, and you can run your pump off the cistern, 500, 1,000 gallons. And those are common things that people are using on the Gulf Islands for drinking water, but you can also use them as a fire suppression reservoir. Again, landscaping, want to focus on getting branches off the roof of the house. You want to make sure that those trees are pruned up. You can see those trees have high crowns on the right. That's going to limit the spread of fire into the crowns, limit the foliage catching on fire, limit the amount of spots that come off those trees onto your house. So I mean, I don't want everybody to think that I'm advocating to cut down every tree on the property. That's not what this is about. If you've got a special tree that's near to your home, get the foliage well off the roof. I like to say at least 5 meters, the branches above the roof. Make sure the stem is pruned up, minimum 2 meters, but preferably as high as 6 meters up will prevent the spread of fire right up the trunk of the tree. You can see this home on the right has a lot of really nice like rhododendrons. That's a lot better option than having the hedge material that we just talked about. Rhododendron will burn, but it won't burn vigorously, and mostly it'll just scorch. The woody material will scorch. Here's an example where even just thinning the crown, this is a pretty ugly tree, but this homeowner wanted it for shade at critical times. So we just recommended that they spiral pruned it, and we thinned out the crown so that it wouldn't explode if it caught on fire. And you can see it's not right on top of the house like it was. Here's some vegetation more like Bowen Island. This is in the Highlands on Vancouver Island. They've used effective lawn. They've kept the arbutus, and they've thinned out the Douglas fir, and they've created a nice 10-meter footprint. They also built access, two-way in and out access. They put in a water collection pond so that they had a reservoir in this subdivision to fight fire. These are little incremental steps where you don't have water that are really important. I think the other thing that I should talk about in terms of Bowen is your roadways are very heavily treed, and in a significant interface fire would be very difficult to create a safe evacuation. And one of the things that we've learned in these big fires over the last few years is evacuation gets very difficult, particularly if you have to move a large number of vehicles through an area, a forested area that's burning close to roadways. And I know from my own experience in spending time on Bowen that you have a lot of roadways where the trees drape right over the roadways, and if they were on fire, they would be a serious hazard to move through. So this applies both at the property level and at some of the main roadways. But if you have a property that's got a significant driveway that's overgrown with trees, you should thin it. Make sure that those trees are well back from the driveway so that both a fire truck could get in and out, and that you can safely evacuate from the property. And I imagine that the way to think about this is, imagine you have to evacuate in a situation where the power's gone out, it's pitch dark, and you have no electricity, and you've got to leave the property. You want to make sure that things are visible, you have a good escape plan, evacuation plan, and that you can see a way out. That's very important. So here's some examples. This home on the left, again, a fairly nice rock garden. The house structure is built to withstand fire, but the trees in the back are too close to the structure. This homeowner in the middle thought that they'd done a great job of fire smarting, but what they did was they took all the material that they removed next to the house and above the house and chipped it on their front lawn. Well, in an ember shower, these chips will burn like the mulch. Don't want that to happen. This house on the right, again, the fellow put an amazing cistern underneath his deck that was linked to a sprinkler system that sprayed the roof. The house was built out of all the right materials. But if you can see in the foreground here, there's a lot of grass, and this is on a steep slope that was grassed all the way to the bottom. This house is vulnerable because if an ember shower started this grass on fire, it would burn right up underneath this deck and potentially start the whole house on fire. This deck needed to be sheathed in, and this cistern shouldn't be sort of half in, half out. It either needed to be right underneath the deck or separated from the house. It's unfortunate this house was 90% there, but would fail on the 10% of these mistakes that they made, because they really didn't understand all of the principles of Firesmart. Again, remove that flammable material away from the house. Here's some examples of propane that was used for cooking. The small bottles are not as big a concern as bigger bottles or bigger propane tanks. You want to make sure that if you do leave trees around your building footprint, that the crowns aren't touching and overlapping. They should be pruned as high as possible. And as I said, a minimum of 2 meters, 6 feet. And all the down fine woody material on the ground, particularly the wood that's 6 inches or less, needs to be cleaned up and removed. Why do I say 6 inches or less? Is because that size class of material creates the spread conditions for fire. That material dries out the easiest and is an ignition hazard as well as a spread hazard. So here's an example of a subdivision that sort of all the homes that were constructed all had Firesmart footprints around all of the homes. They built an extra access coming out of here for evacuation in 2 different directions. They put some fire ponds in here to enhance their water supply. And it was very, you saw the picture earlier here, that this was one of the homes in that subdivision. And so you also want to be thinking about dead end access. Ideally, you've got more than one way out of your property. If you don't, then you need to think about alternative evacuation. There is always the thought consideration that if you're next to the water, that's a place you can go to, or you've got a beach that you can go down to. And Bowen certainly, for some homes, has that opportunity if it's not safe to drive through a forested roadway out to a safer place on the island. Here's an example of that fine slash that I was talking about. This is the kind of material next to trails, next to your home, that's vulnerable and flammable, and will spread fire. May not be super hot, but will spread quickly, particularly if there's a wind. And this is the kind of stuff we want to focus on cleaning out. Here's an example of a really dense forest that's been thinned to a level this forest would have initiated a crown fire. It had vertical and horizontal continuity of fuels, and it was thinned to a point where it didn't have that same vertical and horizontal continuity of fuel, and therefore has a much higher probability of surviving a significant fire. Again, some other examples of subdivision. We've talked about evacuation. And really, I want to emphasize that Bowen has done an outstanding job in basically through these workshops, and I don't know if that's happening this year, Jen will be able to talk it after, but previous years, if you came and attended one of these workshops, you were eligible for their chipping program that would help you dispose of material on your property. The best way is for collective neighborhoods to work together, have some Firesmart weekends where you work collectively on each other's properties, either rent a chipper, bring an arborist in to assist, and share some of those costs. And that's where we see the most gains, rather than as individual property owners, you try to tackle this. So there's lots of really good examples where community Firesmart weekends of specific neighborhoods have helped to move communities to a much better standard of Firesmart. And I know that through the Community Resilience Initiative, you can build Firesmart neighborhood plans, and those Firesmart neighbor plans then make you eligible to become a certified Firesmart neighborhood and apply for funds through the Firesmart program. So I'm not sure that Jen knows that, but that's available to selective groupings of houses. So for example, in Naramata, there was a project last year, another one in Heritage Hills in south of Penticton. So there's all kinds of different opportunities. So I've spoken for an hour. You're probably asleep, hopefully not, but I'm going to open the floor for discussion, questions, and it used to be you could throw tomatoes when I was on Bowen Island, but I'm protected from that now, so I can only take verbal abuse. Thank you, everybody. So Jen, the floor is yours.
I'm going to turn it over to Aaron here.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Bruce. That was really great. Really good information for everybody there. I did want to remind everyone that the fire department is conducting free Firesmart assessments. We'll come around and check your property out and give you a rating of where you fall into the Firesmart category. Once you have one of those assessments done, you're then eligible for up to a $500 rebate to have work done on your property, with, for limbing, chipping, anything really to make your property more Firesmart. And that all the information, basically just send us an email at firesmart@bimbc.ca, and we'll provide any information you want regarding the Firesmart program. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one. You were talking about propane tanks.
Correct.
You said it depends on the size.
Yeah.
What is a safe size the safer size to have near your house. I have two 40-pound tanks. Sounds like it's a little bit out of the safety zone. Is that correct?
I could default to the fire department, but I would say yes. The barbecue size tank we can live with, but as those tanks get bigger and cylinder size, those are hazardous. So if it's cylinder size, I would say you probably want to move it away from the house.
Bruce, can I add to that? It's Allison.
Allison.
If you had 3 or 4 of those 20-pounders all lined up together, is that good?
No. I mean, I think it's acceptable to maybe have one, but more than one, in my opinion, is pushing the risk to a level that I wouldn't be as comfortable with. I should say that barbecues, I've been to 2 barbecue fires where individuals have been barbecuing, they've left their barbecue open, they put some meat or something on it, and it flared up on the barbecue, went up into the soffits, went onto the roof, and then the whole deck area caught on fire and the propane exploded. So there is examples of that happening. So, and we had one of those incidents here in North Van. Whole house was destroyed, surrounded by 17 trees. It was a rainy November weeknight, about 10 o'clock at night, and I can say it was coastal. It was about it rained about 100 millimeters during this rain event over a 24-hour period, and the whole house was destroyed. And of the 17 trees around the property, we had to remove 9 of them that were scorched and burned during the fire. So you can see how hot just from that. I mean, you cannot imagine how hot it will be on a July afternoon with wind, and you've got propane and some of these other hazards around your house.
Thank you.
You
Can
have
I
a,
ask another one, or is there somebody else on the list? Are we using the hands up thingy on the right, Jen, or?
I'd say go ahead, Allison, it's fine. And then I'll get to the questions in the group chat afterwards.
Okay. Bruce, I sent you a bunch of pictures and they're probably wider, but I guess the one question is, if there's dead trees fairly close to your driveway or your road or on your property, is it best to remove them, or are they still a fire hazard, or are they a worse fire hazard when they're dead? Dead
Well,
cedars, dead hemlocks, dead firs?
As they're standing, Allison, I don't want to say they're necessarily a fire hazard. When they fall and move to the ground, they create a fuel accumulation, and that's when they're more of a fire hazard. But there's also a safety, there's a couple parts to this you got to think about. There's a safety part. If it's near your driveway and they're vulnerable to wind and they're a wind throw hazard, then you also have to think about them hitting your house or hitting someone moving off your driveway. But on the other hand, that dead wood is valuable biologically for birds and other things. So my recommendation would be if you have it on your property, it's within 1.5 tree lengths to your driveway, I would have them assessed and decide whether you want to remove them or not. Certainly until they fall to the ground though, I don't consider them to be a significant fire hazard because they don't have the foliar biomass that would carry a fire or would crown or would be a hazard per se.
So just sort of thinking about the pine beetle stuff that was in the interior,
Yeah.
they still had their foliage and everything, I guess. So that was why they were more of an issue.
Well, the pine beetles, yeah, the pine beetle, one is the foliage turned red. So they had a stage of the pine beetle that was called the red attack. And that had very low foliar moisture. And those trees were like Roman candles when they went up. So they were very difficult to control. Then what happened is all the needles fell off and we went to a gray attack stage. And during that stage, the hazard was not as high. But over the almost 20 years since the beetle killed those trees are all falling down on the ground now, and they're like matchsticks on the ground, and they're a tremendous hazard. And so when you've got multiple trees that have died, multiple trees that have gone to the ground, then you have a very significant hazard.
Okay, and the last one to do with the trees is there's a lot of small firs, you know, they're maybe not even 2 inches diameter and maybe 6 to 7 feet tall, and they're all dying. They're
Yes.
dead.
Yes.
And those have still got their needles on them and they would ease and they're falling over the ground. So those ones should be removed.
They should, because basically they're contributing to that fine fuel layer because they're losing all their foliage, they're losing all their small branches, and you'll get a lot of fines associated with those. And that's the fuel that the bigger trees that were in your picture that were dead, they're coarse, what we call coarse fuel. They're not easily ignited. The small stuff, that less than 6-inch material, is the stuff that's really prone to drying out quickly and prone to ignition. So you're right that you want to remove those.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So I see in the chat there's a question from Gemma Green. How does Firesmart reconcile the recommendation to thin forest and prevent canopy closure with drying of the forest floor that results from increased exposure and evaporation? How do we retain soil moisture without the shading of trees? That's a great question. That's an excellent question, because the compromise in thinning is that you create more light and you have more evapotranspiration and you may have more wind blowing through the stand of trees. We typically target about a 40% crown closure, and that's still enough crown closure to shade the stand. Also, it encourages more succulent vegetation to develop in the understory, and that succulent vegetation typically reduces the flammability of the surface fuel. If you're on a really dry site and you're encouraging grass by opening it up, it's probably better not to open it up as much and not encourage grass or flammable material, but to prune the trees up so that the branches are well above the ground. So if a fire does occur on the ground, it's not going to go up into the trees. Does that answer your question? Okay. We'll go to Grant Henderson. I guess it's just a comment. Okay, we live on a 10-acre plot on Gambier Island and have a wood chipper, but no way to remove the chip material. What are the best practices with dealing with large quantities of wood chip beyond spreading them thinly outside of zone 2 in the forest? Actually, that's not a bad practice as long as you keep the chip depth below 10 centimeters. I would not put down fresh chips until we're in a low fire danger later in the fall, so that you have the whole winter for decomposition. So we have done extensive chipping in the resort municipality of Whistler because we can't burn. We've been using this 10-centimeter rule, and if there's enough light, we find I mean, we get a big snow load there. It's fairly moist there during the winter. We found that we're losing 50% of the chips per year in decomposition, and they become incorporated into the forest floor and are not a hazard. Did that answer your question? Okay, good. Any other questions?
There's one more in the chat box.
Okay.
Water storage tank, would we also need a water pump? And if we need a pump, what size pump is required?
So basically you do need a pump, and ideally you're gonna run the water storage tank up into a sprinkler system on the roof. You don't need a super large pump. You need, like, Honda makes a really good high utility basic pump that you just need it to run like a sprinkler. So as long as it's got enough pressure to run a sprinkler, it's going to be adequate. And most of the small Honda pumps have that capacity. And I would just, my recommendation is go to Honda, explain what you're trying to do. You want enough pressure to be able to spray a sprinkler over the footprint of your home. And remember, gas, not electric, particularly if you're vulnerable to a power outage. Okay, I see another new message. Is there a list of best species, age, size of coarse debris to have on the ground to actually increase moisture levels on the site? We have some landscaping guidelines that I've produced for some other communities on the coast that I can send to Jen, and she can put it on your website. It recommends what to plant, what not to plant. Ideally, you want succulent, deciduous type vegetation. So I talked about hedging. Laurel hedges typically are more succulent. Now, there's always the trade-off between needing water to keep these plants alive during the dry season versus not. And I know that Bowen has got, you know, issues with water. So you have to be careful that you're not planting something that you got to water every 5 days. But ultimately, you want to balance. You don't want a lot of woody material, because that woody material dies, creates fine fuel, and that fine fuel becomes a hazard. But I'll send that list to Jen, and she can post that on your website.
So I'll just take a second to update the crowd on the attendance, just because I said I would. In 2018, we had about 75 members of the public attend multiple presentations, as well as approximately 20 of the volunteer fire rescue members. In 2019, we had approximately 60 people attend these presentations, and we presented separately to different sub-communities, and the attendance was at around 80 people at all those events. So probably closer to over 200 people reached since we started doing this, hopefully. I know as well, when we look at the island survey year over year, there's an improvement or an increase in the number of respondents who are aware of the Firesmart program and who have taken steps to Firesmart their homes. So I think arguably since we started, there's been an increase in awareness, if not action. And then just to follow up, there are tons of printed Firesmart materials. So it's probably not an issue for this Zoom crowd, but if anyone is more comfortable with printed materials, we have lots of those available at the hall or the fire hall, and you can reach out to myself or any of the fire department members to access those, particularly if you want a bunch to share with your neighbors. We're happy to facilitate that. And then I think I'll just finish my speaking by thanking the NERPs, the Neighborhood Emergency Response Program folks who are on the line today, who came and also helped spread the word around the community about this event. So thanks guys for helping us out. And I see there are more questions since I started talking. So I'll turn it back over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Jen. Great summary. Glad to hear there was 200. That's great. So Grant Henderson says, in the case where you are at the peak of a hill and unable to fully manage the grass risk on the hill due to the slope or other ownership, are there ways to mitigate the risk of the fire racing up the hill beyond, for example, roof sprinklers with a 10-meter radius? The only thing I can suggest, if you've got the 10-meter radius, that's the best chance you have. There's nothing to stop you from weed whacking grass to extend out beyond 10 meters. The best time to really cut the grass is right about now, so that it cures and decomposes before the fire season. And you hit it at a time where it tends to dry out now. So June, unless if we get a lot of rain in June, you might have to whack it again towards the end of June. But if we have a dry June, generally hitting it now sets it back. So my only suggestion is getting a weed whacker and cutting that grass to extend beyond that 10-meter zone. Hopefully that answered your question. The other option, you can use some landscaping fabric and some gravel in that zone to suppress the grass to extend your zone outward if you so choose to. Next question from Byron. We're on the Cove Bay municipal water system. How reliable would our water pressure be for a roof sprinkler even during an emergency? I would default to Ian or Aaron to answer that question. You're the experts on Bowen.
Yeah, I can answer that question. That in most cases, even during an emergency power outage or anything like that, your water pressure would still be just fine. It would take a very extended period of time with high usage before you would have any issues with water.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Just want to point out the key thing. I think it's probably evident, but it is really important if you're planning on, Bruce, probably you should speak to this, but if you're planning on having a roof sprinkler, to make sure that you have some way of powering it, you should probably assume that the power will be out in this scenario. So if your sprinkler is running off of your well pump, then you need to reconsider. So not necessarily a problem in Cove Bay, but for other communities.
And usually a 5-gallon jerry can of gas, like the larger jerry can of gas, is what you want to run the pump. Because ideally you want to run that pump, you're going to leave your property and probably leave the sprinkler running. So you're hoping it's going to run anywhere from 6 to 12 hours ahead of a fire. That's generally what we try to achieve. By that time, if the fire is getting close to your home, you're going to see some fire resources come to help and provide other resources that would support the sprinkler system that you've got in place.
Can I ask one more question?
You don't have to ask permission, Allison.
Okay. I was interested in your comment about the Squamish fire and that the mosses were burning. I mean, we have an awful lot of rock with moss covering, and it gets pretty dry in the summertime. So an inadvertently flicked cigarette or something, could that set all that on fire and causes a problem?
Honestly, from what the intel that I've been able to get, it was an ember from somebody burning on their private property, started the grass next to the right-of-way on fire, and then that spotted into the forest onto this moss cover, which then carried with the wind they had that day. There's a lot of wind. I think the winds, when I looked at the weather, were around 30K. It was an outflow. And I would say it was the contributing factors were that low relative humidity I talked about, the wind, and the ambient temperature. It was in the low 20s. I think it was 21. So you can imagine we get days of 30 degrees, probably relative humidity is below 20%, and you're on an island that faces northwesterlies. You have all the right conditions, particularly on the, I guess I would say it's the westerly side, southwesterly side of the island. Yeah. Yeah, so Grant's asked about the size of gas tanks. Yeah, I think the 5 gallons, 9 to 10 hours, you can hook that up. You can hook those up. There are ways to hook up those pumps to increase the reservoirs. You just, at the time you buy the pump, you just want to make sure you get the right fittings. I think it's a gas cap with a hose to the bigger pump, and then that draws gas into the reservoir in the pump. I don't have the exact, it depends on the pump, and you just have to do your homework. Okay, I think we're good, Jen.
Nobody wants to show their face to ask a question, apparently.
That's a common Zoom factor.
You don't have to show your face to ask a question.
That's right. Okay, last chance, everyone.
All right, well, yeah, oh, sorry, Jen, but thanks everyone for coming, and don't forget to book your Firesmart assessment at firesmart@bimbc.ca.
Thank you guys for setting it up.
Yes, thanks for the organizers and to Bruce.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Bruce, could you just put that address in the chat so that we can grab it?
Which address did you want?
Or the Firesmart at BC, or whoever had that one?
Hang on, I can probably just do that right now.
I'm just,
Oops.
oh, there we go.
On the
Oh, you got
Firesmart website?
Jen, you want to make that available? It's available on the
Okay, I just need to.
on the meeting invite, isn't it? On your website?
Absolutely. It's in the chat box now. It's available at the Bowen Island Municipality website if you go to the Firesmart webpage.
Got it.
And then, of course, you're always welcome to phone or email the municipality general line if you can't get a hold of us, and they'll steer you in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the great seminar.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.
Thank you.